welcome to Dustin's Kaleidoscope. I am Dustin, and today I have the pleasure of having Elinor Mattern here today with me. She is a poet, a teacher, a writer, an entrepreneur. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm really excited to be here.
I'm so glad you're here. We met a few months ago at a fair, and after I found out that you were a poet, I'm like, I have to have you on my show. I've been looking for a poet, so I'm so glad that you're here.
Thank you. And when you said that to me, I mean, it's not every day that someone says, please, let's talk about poetry, unless they're already a poet. Or
That's true.
We have some fans, but, you know, a lot of people kind of run away from poetry.
And that's what I wanted to talk to you about, because I think it's something that a lot of people, it's not intuitive. Like, people will go to short stories, novels, things like that. So let's start from the beginning, and maybe you can tell us a little bit about your background.
Okay. Well, I was born in the 50s, and it was kind of a typical, my parents encouraged me to be a teacher. And at that point, there were a lot of limitations on how people saw the future for girls, for their ability to have a profession and to make a living for themselves. So teaching seemed like a safe bet, I think, for my parents. And it turned out it's been really wonderful for me, but at the time when I was younger, it felt kind of limiting, you know, because I had these other things I wanted to do. I thought about journalism. I wanted to major in art or philosophy in college, and it kind of felt like all those things were discouraged, and teaching was like the safe route. So I taught elementary school for a number of years, and it was a great experience. And then later I was able to kind of transfer that into teaching collge. So
that's wonderful. Was that like a really big jump for you, or like elementary school, not even to high school, but to college?
Right. It was kind of a gradual thing. When my daughter was younger, I was teaching part-time. And then elementary school part-time, which is unusual. It was a private school, so it was part-time. Meanwhile, I was developing my art, and I was starting to write, and I was feeling like I needed to find new ways to grow as an artist and grow as a writer. But teaching was always my kind of the backbone. And so I found a part-time non-credit teaching gig at a community college in ESL. That was my original transition. And ESL, it's great because it's about language, it's about communication. And I had so much fun with that. And then I went from teaching ESL non-credit part-time to I was an adjunct, then I became full-time, and then I finished my master's in poetry and switched from ESL to the English department. And then over the years I taught writing in all different forms, but creative writing, specifically poetry, is my forte and my favorite part of it.
Now, how did you get into writing poetry? Because as you said, it's not something that most people start off doing.
Right.
But did you start off doing it, or did you?
You know, I did a little when I was a kid, but I never really knew what to do with it, and it was kind of an off and on thing over the years. But actually, more consistently, I did artwork all through my life. I always needed to make things. And so in my 20s and my 30s, I was really trying to take myself seriously as an artist. And then, but I always read a lot, and poems were always just part of my life. And so right around 40, you know, kind of one of those midlife things, early, whatever, I don't know, what is midlife anymore, who knows? But some kind of transitional thing around 40, I decided to take a creative writing workshop. And I have to say, changed my life. In fact, I should say to anyone who wants to write, take classes, take workshops.
Really?
Because it really, it made all the difference. I could actually spend the whole time here just raving about my first writing teacher, because he really did change my life, and that was a few years ago, and he's still a part of my life as an amazing mentor and friend. Yeah, he's really 20-some years. And so I walked into a creative writing class just kind of vaguely thinking I wanted to write some poems, or actually I thought I wanted to write some essays, personal essays, about the challenges of being a mother and an artist, trying to balance those two things. And so I just looked in the paper, found a creative writing class at an art center, a local art center. I lived at the shore at the time. Ventnor, New Jersey was where I took this class with Peter Murphy. And he happens to be a poet. And in his creative writing class, it was mixed genre, so you could write whatever you wanted, but he so enamored of poetry, and he's so great at talking about poetry and giving examples of poems, that I found myself falling in love with poetry too. And so even though I've done other types of writing over the years, poetry has been really my main thing. And the thread of the question was, how did I start writing poetry?
Right.
So walking into the door of the Ventnor Art Center 20-some years ago was
And
the
that's
beginning.
how you got started. And so what was it about poetry? I know it sounds like your teacher encouraged poetry because that was his emphasis, but what was it about poetry that really spoke to you?
Well, I think there's so many, obviously, so many different ways to write, so many different types of writing. One of the things that's fun about both reading and writing poems is, ironically, I guess, part of what's fun for people who love poems, in a way it's kind of the obstacle for people who don't love poems, which is sometimes they do take a little extra work. You might have to read it twice. You might have to stop and think about, what does this image mean? What is it suggesting? What is it symbolic of? So sometimes people are kind of in a hurry and they don't necessarily want to do that. But if you just take that extra minute, the surprises and the unexpected connections.
So now that you've broken it down a bit, can you explain to us what is the difference, like when you're approaching a poem, writing a poem, how is that different from writing maybe a paragraph of something that's very well described? Like, what is the?
It's a great question.
What's the
It's a
difference?
wonderful question. And since I've taught this stuff in college, I could talk for hours on it. I would love to. But I'll go back to one of the examples, Peter Murphy. I mention him a lot. Years ago, I remember him saying that good fiction, if you think about it, or prose, which is anything not in poetic form, good fiction could be like a glass of orange juice. A poem would be like orange juice concentrate, which a lot of people don't even have anymore. But it's that really,
yeah, that you
like
have
when you
to add-
squeeze the water out. And
Right.
it's intense, it's dense, it's rich. It doesn't have a lot of extra stuff.
Okay.
So when you tell a story, you could take an incident in your life and write, a 3-page essay or 5-page essay about it, or you could take out all the extra stuff and just save the most potent, most striking details, kind of distill it down to, 20 or 30 line poem.
See, you're going to make me want to go and write poetry.
Oh,
as soon as I
excellent,
can.
excellent. Well, then you can take my class.
Because that's one of the things because as I was preparing for this, I was thinking about what most people think about poetry. One, they think it's very highbrow, and you have to it's very esoteric, or it's rhymey or something like that. But the way you're describing it is just taking away the parts that you don't need, distilling it,
Right,
and
right.
and what you're trying to get across still comes across.
Right,
It's
like the
just not
essence.
Yes.
Well, I love the way you said that because in teaching creative, I teach creative writing. Little
Okay.
plug here. I retired 2 years ago from teaching full time, so
Oh, okay.
I get to freelance. I do a little here and there.
Okay.
And but I have taught it on the college level. And one of the things that I try to make a connection for students who are hesitant about writing poems, reading poems, how many people in the audience, in a classroom, everywhere, love songs? Everybody loves songs.
Right.
Virtually everybody loves. I haven't run
Yes.
across a student yet who doesn't love songs. And so I would always spend a little time talking about what are the differences and similarities between a song and a poem. And the biggest thing, really, is that the song relies on a musical instrument to provide the musical accompaniment to keep
Right.
it moving. With a poem, there's music, but it's within the words. So that's one of the elements of craft, that it doesn't have to be rhyming, although a lot of people fall back on end rhymes because that's familiar. But there are so many other ways to make a poem have some internal music that helps it come alive, helps it hang together without a musical instrument, but with the language. And so a student once wrote down, because I often would have students, write feedback for me on things they want to learn more about or things they want help with. And a student once wrote, I can't seem to get out of rhyming. I always want to rhyme all the time. Can you help me break out of that? And so I kind of wrote up like an essay on what are other things you can do to break through from rhyming. Rhyming has its place. It's not that rhyming isn't useful or fun, but The tricky things with the traps that you can fall into with rhyming are, one, it can sound sing-songy.
Right.
Two, and we're talking about end rhymes, rhymes at the end of the line. It can sound sing-songy. It can sound it can be predictable and trite. So, if you put the word June, then moon is going to be, it's just so predictable.
Right.
So, so other things you can do are play around with rhymes so that there are two rhymes within a line.
Oh, okay. Because
Called
you're not
in-
expecting that.
Right, exactly, called internal rhyme. Or you also can do what's called a near rhyme. So it's something like tree and feet. You've got the vowel sound the same, but not the same ending. You also can do what's called an I rhyme, which is where it looks like it would rhyme, like though and bow, but when you read it out loud, it doesn't rhyme. So what is the purpose of these alternatives is that it gives the piece of writing this density of language and a little bit of music for the ear or the brain that make it distinctive from other kinds of writing.
Right.
And one other, alliteration. I don't want to forget alliteration,
yes,
where they start at the
yes.
beginning. The words start with the same sound at the beginning. Also, repetition can do that as well.
Okay. So what is your favorite type of poem to write and to read?
It's a great question, but again, I could talk about it for hours because when people say type of poem, I was thinking about this ahead of time, and I thought, if you say what kinds of poems are there, you could list types of poems from 10 different angles or more. So, for example, some poems you could break down into, they're either narrative or lyric.
Okay.
So what's a narrative poem? Tells a story. What's a lyric poem? A lyric poem doesn't rely on a story. It relies more on the other elements of poetry, which would be the music within it, the form, and the images.
Okay.
Now, as a poet, I don't happen to be a narrative poet. A lot of famous poems, I should have thought of a few famous poems ahead of time that, like Robert Frost and
Right.
famous people, like kind of the classics. A lot of them are narrative because people enjoy the storytelling element to it. But then other poems that are led by the image, led by the sounds, that's called a lyric poem, and it doesn't have to have a narrative story to make it work.
Okay.
I happen to love lyric poems.
So that would be like your preferred
Right.
type of poem.
Right, but one of the threads that keeps coming through everything we're talking about is the level of mystery in a poem. And some people don't enjoy that unknown factor within a poem where it's like, well, like I said earlier, you have to work at it a little. With a
Right.
lyric poem, you often have like an image, a memory, a spark of something, but you don't have the story. So
So it's a nice combination, it sounds like, where you can get a lot of different pieces all in one poem. So,
if I can go ahead with that, though,
Elinor, we're just about out of time
Okay.
for this segment. So I'm gonna have you pick up on the other side. I'm gonna have you tell us what you're about to tell us on
Okay,
the other side.
great,
So
great.
this is Dustin's Kaleidoscope, and we will be right back.
It's an onion.
Hi, and welcome back to Dustin's Kaleidoscope. I am Dustin, and I am here today with Elinor Mattern, and she is telling us a little bit about poetry, but we're going to talk, actually at the end of the break, you were going to tell us a few other types of poems. So, so I want you to continue right
okay,
there.
Good. So the question of what types of poems are there and what types do I like to write or read, there are many different ways to look at it, and I mentioned lyric versus narrative.
Yes.
Yes. Okay. You
Also
also
different
could-
components. in it.
Exactly.
Okay.
Right. Right. You also could look at it as classical versus contemporary in terms of reading.
Okay.
So many people love to read classical poems, but they may not be aware of all the contemporary poems that are being written today.
Okay.
Obviously, poets today can't write classical poems, although they can use classical styles. Some of it would be recommended in terms of practicing with forms, but contemporary poets don't want to make the mistake of sounding like they're trying to be someone who wrote in the 1700s.
Exactly,
But
yeah.
sometimes they can be playful with it, and maybe they're doing it for some reason.
Right.
But sometimes students get into a mode of, like, sort of like artificial stilted sounding poems, kind of like trying to pattern them after old-fashioned poems, and that's not usually going to be very successful today, let's just
Okay.
say. So, but there's so much going on in contemporary poetry that a lot of people don't know about. Sometimes in schools, kids are only learning about the classics, and sometimes they don't have the advantage of finding out about a lot of contemporary
And that's
work.
what I find. I since I have a son, he shares with me his poems,
Oh,
and
huh.
I know that that is exactly what he has learned. Like a lot of the classics, but it would be great to
Oh,
learn a little
yeah.
bit and understand a little bit more about the contemporary poem. So I get that.
I actually think this goes back to an earlier question of yours, which is, how to invite people into poems and into
Yes,
poetry would be
yes.
to share with young people all the contemporary work that's out there, performance poets and all kinds of things
Yes.
going on, and New Yorican Cafe in New York, all different things that are sometimes kids who say they don't like poems, it's because they have only been introduced to the classics. Or poems that appeal to a 50-year-old teacher, which may not have any connection to them.
Exactly.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
that, and I'm glad you mentioned that. I want you. I know that you're going to read a poem, but before you do that, can you give our audience members any direction as to how to go about finding poetry that you like? And because, like you said, a lot of us are introduced to the classics.
Yes,
and
okay.
that's it. Like,
Excellent. And at the end, I'm going to talk about some resources. So I would
Oh,
say one thing
okay.
that's great to do is there's a website called poets.org.
Okay.
And they have, you can sign up to get a poem a day in your mailbox.
Oh, that's cool.
And what's great is sometimes they're contemporary, fresh things of people you never heard of. Sometimes they're classics mixed in. Sometimes you'll love them, sometimes you'll hate them, and that's part of the fun.
Right.
I don't love all the poems that I get in my inbox.
because you can
But
find something you like.
Exactly, exactly.
And the fact that you like it is
Right.
really nice.
So the main thing is to read more poems, and that's a really easy way to do that, is to have it come to your mailbox every day.
Right.
But also explore tons. If you just type in poetry, you'll get tons of websites. Some you'll like, some you won't.
And I'm so glad that you mentioned that the different types, because there are poetry slams, like you said, there's the New
Right.
Yorican
Cafe,
poet
yeah.
slams. I mean, there are
Yeah,
so
exactly,
many different
exactly.
ways of expressing yourself
right.
through poetry, or
Right.
even listening to somebody else.
Exactly, right. And it's out there, so yes. The other thing is taking a workshop. If you're even remotely interested in poems for reading or writing poems, there are creative writing workshops at most high schools, most art centers, community colleges, and colleges have them as well. And taking a workshop will open up so much, certainly will open up possibilities for you to write that you might not have thought of, that people
Okay.
might not have thought of, yeah.
So I hope now, can you read a poem?
Oh, I would love to read a poem. And so one of the other
This is one you've written.
yes, I'll read a
Okay.
poem I wrote.
Awesome.
Of course, it's not hard to talk me into that. But one of the big topics with poems also, which we sort of touched on, is the level of accessibility. So with students, I often, have them read a poem and then say, how accessible is this to you? Do you have to read it 5 times to get a clue? Do you get it on the first reading? And different people are comfortable with, as I mentioned, different levels of mystery. So some people like it to be all right there, boom. And other people, dig a little, read a few times. I'm going to read a poem that's very accessible, and
Okay.
I think that when I write, I experiment with levels of accessibility. Some of my poems are a little surreal, a little mysterious. Sometimes people scratch their heads. I actually, one of the poems that got rejected from a journal, the editor wrote, "This poem is beautifully written, but a bit too cryptic for our taste." So it's like, okay, some of my poems are cryptic, but some of my poems are very accessible, and I thought just for fun, I'd read a poem that's very accessible.
All right.
And
Sounds great.
maybe at the risk of being a little too sweet, which is one of the tricky things with poems. How do you write about the beautiful emotions without sounding mawkish or sentimental? So this kind of just maybe is at the edge of this, but it's
Okay.
for my daughter, and she did say she wanted to watch this TV show, and she's not always been a fan of poetry, so I thought it would be fun to read a poem about her.
Okay.
Or for her. So, it's called On the Threshold. and it is narrative. So
Okay.
I said I write lyric poems, but I also write
This one
some
is narrative.
Yes,
okay.
exactly.
You
So
switch it up every once in a while. That's
exactly,
nice.
exactly. On the threshold for Rachel. She's 14, running out the door to a dance, wearing clunky heels that make her tower over me when she leans down to kiss me goodbye in the doorway. Suddenly, I remember when she was 5, and I would kiss each of her palms and say if she rubbed them together, they'd turn into a million. Then, if she got lonely, she could put her hand to her cheek and feel me with her. So tonight, I risk. Could I maybe put kisses in your hands? I get the 3-syllable, Mom, and her eyes roll. But she smiles and gives me her hands.
That's beautiful.
Well, thank you.
That's
you,
really beautiful.
Thank you. And you can see the narrative.
Yes.
And you can see it's accessible. Like, you didn't have to go, oh, what is she trying to...
I knew exactly. See, and I think that's the thing about poetry. Like, that's almost like a little short story. And I think
Right.
that's the thing. Most people have this very narrow vision of this is poetry. That was that
But now, if I
Wow.
had told it as a story, it would take 2
much
pages,
longer.
maybe.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But,
So-
that's really
Well,
nice.
thank you.
So for something like that, like, can you explain the process? Like, did that take you a week? Did that take you 30 minutes? Did it take you a month? Like, what is your process? And I know it's individual. That's why I'm specifically asking.
Even though there are individual differences, as a teacher, I would stress the magic word is revision.
Okay.
Revision. It's very rare to write a poem and nail it down in the first draft. So, like any good writing, you have to take some time with it, and because of the way language in poems is dense, is distilled and condensed, you often have to go back later, maybe cut some things. Pardon me, other times you may have to go back and add an image. It might be too vague, and you might have to add some image or some detail.
Okay.
But revision is the biggest thing. So I would say most of my poems, I revise between 5 and 20 times.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And I remember when Peter Murphy, my first teacher, when he first said he would revise a poem 20 or 30 times, I'd be like, oh my God, I don't know if I could ever do that. But once you commit to the poem, you want to give it every
Right.
possible.
And I'm just trying to understand the revisions. Are these small
Oh.
revisions? Are these major revisions?
A little of
because-
both. A little of
Okay.
both. So for example, this time, with this poem, I didn't, the ending was longer and it felt too clunky. Ironically, I talked about clunky shoes, but so I needed to condense it, cut some fluff out, you know. And yeah, it's just kind of, for some poems I have to add more, other poems I have to cut back.
Okay.
But in general, I mean, you can always start with free writing. You know, free write, just get some ideas
Oh,
down,
and then
and
whittle
then
it
take it.
down.
It's like the sculpture where you take
You
where
take
they
away
cut
what
away
you don't need.
right, and then the form appears.
Okay, that's a great way to. That's a great way to think of it.
Cool.
Very poetically said.
Oh, well, thank you. Not original with me, but
But
thank you.
I
Okay,
understand.
very good. Okay.
You know, I don't want us to run out of time
Yes.
before you show us some of your artwork.
Okay, so I did mention that I started doing visual art.
Yes.
So this is just kind of an abstraction of a landscape. I love color. Color's always been a big draw for me. And so over the
Is this
years,
water paint?
this is acrylic.
Acrylic, okay.
But what I found was I worked small when my daughter was younger because I would steal little chunks at time.
Oh, of
And I
course.
could
Yes.
squeeze a little bit in here and there. And so I've always kind of needed to make things. And one of the things I do a lot of is I take a lot of my images. So I have over the years, I've done watercolors and acrylics and photography and batik, you know.
Yes, of course, yes.
Exactly. So what I do is a lot of the images that I've made in other forms, like the original of this is like, 3 feet by 5 feet, and it's a batik, but then I make everything into note cards, and that's a way
What a
to,
That's
so I have
wonderful.
paintings, and then I have a poem with a piece of a photograph, and so my note
That's
cards
so
are,
personal. I like that. So when you
Well, thank
give
you.
someone, you're actually giving them a part of you. Like you put some
Mm-hmm.
thought into
you.
it. I really like that. And those are beautiful.
well,
by the
thank
way.
you. And then I have this transition thing where, ta-da, if you would hold that.
Sure.
So then, as I said, I like to make stuff. So I started making little,
Oh, that goes with that.
So,
I love it.
I
love it.
I
love
sell
it.
them. I sell some of them. I love to give them away. It's really fun. And then when I when I give away the note cards, it's kind of like a business card, because
Oh, right, because it represents you.
And I
yes.
had a period where I started to think, well, people, about 10 years ago, I thought, people don't really write note cards much anymore, individual personal notes, they don't
Right.
write much anymore. So about 10 years ago, I started thinking, oh, maybe I'm not going to really have any market for my note cards. But I think just like reading books, there are a lot of people, or at least some people, who love handwriting.
Exactly.
They love a personal note. I mean, who
Yes.
doesn't love to get a note in the mail
I
that's
just
handwritten?
wrote a letter yesterday.
Did you really?
I love writing
Great.
letters.
Okay. So this is my other one of my
Calligraphy
other.
pen, I'm all
Oh,
in.
wonderful,
I like that.
wonderful.
So that's great that you have
So-
something like that, and I like that this accompanies it. It's a really great transition. Before, I think we have a few minutes left, and I wanted to make sure that you can tell our audience members, like maybe some resources.
Oh, yes, yes.
For poetry. I know you
Yes.
mentioned poetry.org.
Yes,
and getting
very good.
a poem a day. But if there are other suggestions or things
Great.
that
Great. Let's see. Well, Peter Murphy, who I mentioned, my wonderful mentor and friend, has a business of writing workshops, mostly concentrated in New Jersey, but he also even does some internationally.
Oh, okay.
So if you want a writing workshop, go to Murphy Writing, I think it's .org. But
Okay.
any of this, if you Google it, you'll find him. Academy of American Poets, it's a resource online with all kinds of poems, information about poetry, and all of that. The Dodge Foundation has biannual, is that every other year? Every other year? Biannual, semi-annual.
yes,
always
I think
forget.
it's biannual is
Yes.
every other year, right?
Right.
Yes.
Right. They have actually what apparently is the largest poetry festival in the United States, if not the
Oh.
world, is in New Jersey every other
Oh, I-
fall.
I did
So
not even
not
know
this
that.
fall, but next year it will be.
Okay.
So that's at dodgefoundation.org. People
Okay.
can find that. And Poets Online, a wonderful New Jersey guy, Ken Ronkowitz, has a website that has prompts, ideas for starting poems, and lots of resources about poetry on his website. And I happen to get my Master of Fine Arts at Fairleigh Dickinson, if I can make a plug for that.
Absolutely.
Renee Ashley was my amazing mentor, so
Oh,
that's...
this is great. These are great
Okay.
resources. But before we
Terrific.
leave, we have less than a minute. Can you tell people how they can get in contact with you?
Yes, okay. Well, my website is under construction, so I don't
Okay.
have it ready yet. So simply just, at this point, Facebook, Elinor Grace Arts on Facebook.
That is great. Thank you so much for telling us all about poetry. I'm inclined to go home and write a few poems.
Okay.
If I do, I'll share them with you.
That would be great. I'd love it.
Privately.
I would love it.
But thank you so much. This has been great. It's really great information.
Thank
And
you.
thank you for sharing your poem with us. That was a
Well, thank
beautiful
you,
poem.
And thank you for great questions about a wonderful art form.
Thank you. So this is Dustin's Kaleidoscope. We will see you next time. Bye.